On this episode of China Unscripted, how deep does Chinese corruption go in the Trudeau government? Canada's laws target free speech more than foreign interference, and why the CCP is the super mafia. Welcome to China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
And I'm Matt Gnezda.
And Shelley is currently pulling the strings as the real mastermind behind the Wagner Group mutiny in Russia. She'll be back once she finishes destabilizing world powers. And joining us today is Sam Cooper. He's an award-winning Canadian investigative journalist, founder of the new independent investigative platform, The Bureau, and author of the book Wilful Blindness, How a Network of Narcos, Tycoons, and CCP Agents Infiltrated the West. Sam, it's great to have you back on.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Well, since we last had you on, there's a lot that's come out about how the Chinese Communist Party has interfered in Canadian society, especially their connections with the Trudeau family. And of course, all these accusations are racist, as Justin Trudeau said in response to the allegations. So why do you hate Chinese people, Sam?
Well, I'm thinking back to our last conversation, and at that time you asked me, what's really going on with the Trudeau government? Do they seem to be a little bit friendly, to some folks in mainland China? Why aren't they acting? And at that time, I was connecting some dots with you guys and saying, well, the full story isn't in yet, but it's starting to look like something may be a little bit off. But to your question, look, let's be very straight up. I've said it before. For Justin Trudeau to say that scrutinizing the interference of the Chinese Communist Party in diaspora communities, where these police stations are surveilling people on the soil in America, in Canada, New York, Boston, Toronto, Vancouver, for him to say it's racist, look, that is Ministry of State Security propaganda. And we can make a joke about it. It's ridiculous, but it's profane. It's absurd for Mr. Trudeau and anyone in his party to be picking up MSS talking points, because that's harmful to the societies where that message is amplified. For it to be amplified for a head of state, I'm sorry, that's Banana Republic stuff.
And so you said, last time you were kind of connecting some dots about the Trudeau family in China. What has come out now that you can definitively say?
Well, as you know, last November, I started to break some stories that really, for people watching the party, watching Beijing, watching their activities in Australia, New Zealand, United States, around the world, look, everyone knew they were up to no good. But from what I've heard from people that should know in intelligence communities, my reports were the first time that definitively said agents in a consulate in a democratic country, Canada, Toronto, directly sent clandestine transfers into election interference networks. My report said the allegations were that Canadian intelligence found 11 favored candidates in the Toronto area alone were part of a network that received funding from the Chinese Communist Party. So this is bombshell stuff. And as you know, it went a lot further. The reports were about MPs that are critical of China being attacked. There's been many more follow reports since my first one, but where are we? The Trudeau Foundation, that is this family foundation that coagulates around the Trudeau family, allegedly has received in the order of about over 100,000 American US dollars from an entity connected to the Chinese Communist Party. So this is another news organization in Canada followed up on some information I had also been told of, that a consulate official reached out to a tycoon and suggested that they get a donation into this Trudeau Foundation, which of course is in no way connected to the current prime minister, is the claim. That sort of story has there's been a lot of holes have come out in that story in the past few months.
Well, so $100,000, I mean, for the Trudeau family, that's not that much. It's just, another Maserati.
It's another Maserati, or if you're in Vancouver, McLaren is a very popular car for the princelings and the people that are connected to the party. That is the Beijing party, but information is surfacing the Liberal Party as well through donations. But look, 100,000 apparently was what was ultimately paid by this tycoon with connections to the United Front and connections to the consulate in Toronto. The promises, as I and others have reported, were something in the order of $1 million would be donated to the Trudeau Family Foundation. And so, again, this is kind of bombshell stuff. Everyone knows, especially in Australia, there are reports that led to deep legislative changes in that country when a senator lost his position. Two tycoons, of course, a real estate connected individuals with links to China had donated about $7 million in Australia. And that scandal turned into some real action with the Trudeau Foundation. This news of the donation was big, but have we seen any action besides sort of nothing to see here from this government? No, we haven't yet.
Well, the scandal in Australia, you're talking about Sam Dastyari, right?
The former senator, yes.
So in Australia, started making changes to their law. It's been about 5 years now. What was it that prompted them politically to be able to make those changes?
Well, look, I've reported for the Bureau in my first story that a Canadian intelligence review body explicitly has reported to the Prime Minister about documentation that I got access to, where the Privy Council office, this is the high-level office that advises our Prime Minister and Cabinet on national security matters, they had already reported to our Prime Minister about these legislative changes in Australia that were triggered by, wait for it, one, investigative reporting on leaked intelligence, triggered just a new level of outrage and public discourse around Chinese Communist Party interference in Australia. And yet there was a lot of willful blindness in that society that had to be overcome. In fact, again, my first story for the Bureau says that our Prime Minister Trudeau was told in Australia a lot of criticism that senior politicians, academics, elites were willfully blind to the party's influence for various reasons. And that had to be overcome. And Australia did the right thing, even though China, as you know, is their massive number one trade partner. And they got a foreign agent registry. They got new laws around treason. They got new laws around foreign interference that have teeth, so that if you're working for China under the table in Australia, you could face jail. In Canada, again, my first report for the Bureau said Mr. Trudeau was advised, you should look at these types of reforms in Australia. 4 years ago, he was told that, and nothing has happened. And I believe, guys, that is why whistleblowers came to me last year with the documentation explaining, look, it's being reported up in Canada's government how bad the situation is, and nothing's happening.
Are you alleging that Trudeau is specifically blocking legislation that would stop this kind of Chinese Communist Party interference?
It wouldn't be myself alleging it. It would be whistleblower sources concerned about Canada's national security that are suggesting, as my reports have shown for the past about 6 months now, maybe more, that report after report since at least 2017, probably before, has been going up to the highest levels in the Trudeau government, that China is seeking to influence, fund, criticize, on the other hand, Canadian politicians and elected officials. It's getting worse, and you need to do something, but nothing is happening. So is that an allegation that Trudeau has been willfully blind, just as some of the people in Australia were criticized of being? Look, the facts are starting to point this way. I'm ready to go further than our last conversation. The evidence is this government hasn't acted. Inaction equals willful blindness in this case, I believe.
Willful Blindness would be a good name for a book, don't you think?
You know, it really would be. And I have to level with you guys. When I found a document that said our Prime Minister was told Australian officials are being accused of willful blindness to the infiltration of the Chinese Communist Party, I said, hey, Sam Cooper, he was onto something. I got to pat myself on the back a little bit there.
So is Trudeau facing any kind of consequences for this? Is this putting him in any kind of hot water?
Politically, it has been a hot half year for the Trudeau government, for the advisors surrounding Mr. Trudeau. My reports and others have raised questions from whistleblower sources that fundraising and donors to the Liberal Party, of which Mr. Trudeau is head, uh, their connectivity to allegedly Beijing's United Front, this very sophisticated foreign interference arm. Is that the reason why this government hasn't acted? He has faced those questions. There have been any number of public hearings in Canada stemming from my reports. In an unusual case, I was summoned to testify myself recently. And so that government, I do not believe has taken accountability. There's a lot of denialism happening, but they are in political hot water. The big question in Ottawa right now is this government running down the clock, or it was, as we say in the hockey country of Canada, ragging the puck, skating away from defenders, trying to let essentially this story die down, hoping that more bombshells don't come out. And it has been a little quiet recently. They want to go on summer break, come back in the fall, and not face these, daily questions. Will you agree to a public inquiry? Which, as you know, is what the opposition parties in Canada are demanding right now. A public inquiry into what happened in Canada's last two federal elections and what's happening more broadly with these police stations and just this vast, let's call it an influence, control, harassment mechanism that's attacking democracies, especially Canada.
Well, so remind our audience what happened when the Trudeau government actually appointed a special rapporteur to look into these allegations.
Well, this it reached a level of questions about were there conflicts or perceived conflicts of interest between Canada's former Governor General, the Special Rapporteur, David Johnston, and his connections to the Trudeau family. They had been family skiing buddies. Mr. Johnston sat, wait for it, you can't make this stuff up. He sat on the Trudeau Foundation. He was an important member of that august body that we now know received, it looks like the donor, shortchanged, but, a lot of money from a Chinese Communist Party entity. There were other perceived conflicts that arose. And so Mr. Johnston issued a report within days, I would say, we can say polls showed the majority of Canadians weren't buying it. It was not just these so many perceived connections to Mr. Trudeau himself that made it look like a whitewash or cover up. But guys, you know how dangerous the United Front is in communities in the United States and in Canada, how there's literally, fear of mentioning the words United Front Work Department. When I talk to my sources in the community, people are talking, they're pointing to notepads and writing things. And it's a real level of fear. Mr. David Johnston's report, essentially, he didn't even touch the United Front. And he said, there's nothing odd going on in diaspora communities. It's natural for there to be, connections with the mainland, which essentially, guys, in my view, he just gave the United Front in Beijing carte blanche to operate because, as you know, and my first report for the Bureau said a Vancouver consul general, Chinese official, bragged to controlling 100 community groups. Mr. Johnston's report had no understanding of that, intelligence control of United Front community groups. And I could go on, but there's so many holes in that paper. It's not worth toilet paper in my view.
It's really difficult to hear this. I mean, I can't quite relate because, as an American, we would never have a situation where, potential corruption with China and the highest levels of the government being covered up by the administration. That would never happen.
Nor with Russia.
Nor. So I think it's safe to say that the scope of your investigations has increased a bit from when we first had you on and you were talking about Chinese triads in Vancouver.
No doubt. Again, every time we've talked, I appreciate talking with your team because you get what's happening. it's not a stretch for you to understand that Beijing uses criminal networks worldwide. They use thugs within the country and outside the country as proxies to work with their security agencies. And so I was connecting dots in my book. Really, that's the reason why some whistleblowers reached out. In addition to my work for Global News, my former employer, including a story showing how the United Front vacuumed up PPE worldwide and in Canada during the pandemic. My book really made connections that look, when folks in the Pentagon, that is, U.S. military, are asking me to come in for virtual discussions about the findings of my book, when various U.S. law enforcement agencies would like to talk to me, Canadian law enforcement agencies are saying, you're seeing things that we're starting to see. There's something, I did pretty well with that book, and that has led to new levels of reports and sourcing that are directly connected to the PRC interference files, as I call them.
Well, you are independent now. You have this new investigative journalist website, the Bureau. This gives you a lot more freedom to talk about some of the things you are working on. What's the bleeding edge that you're working on?
The bleeding edge right now is looking at these Operation Fox Hunt police stations or police networks. As you know, kudos to the FBI and a jury in New York just weeks ago, one of these initial Fox Hunt cases in which a former New York cop, it looks like a street level, I'm talking about a different person now, a street level thug that left a threat on a person's door, and a fixer, that is someone that hired various people for the Ministry of Public Security. Look, they were all to varying degrees found guilty of a conspiracy of going after people on American soil for the Chinese government. So this is something where we're starting to see cases result in real penalties in the United States. My information is this type of activity, the intensity and the scope is deeper in Canada, as you would expect. It makes sense because Canada has weak laws, really almost no laws with regards to foreign interference. We don't even have a foreign agent registry. As I've said, the Trudeau government has been sitting on recommendations for at least 4 years now, dithering worse. And so my reporting, the cutting edge, the bleeding edge, as you say, will be looking at what were the warnings, what was known around these illegal Chinese operations in Canada? Why did nothing happen? Will we talk about who's involved? As you know, it can be difficult and scary to report on China. So as an independent journalism outlet, I can use all the support, all the readers that I can to get that truth out there. Legal, as I call it, lawfare could be a concern as well. Canada's protections of freedom of speech are not as solid as the United States. So my work will be, showing Canada's weakness in laws and telling as much truth as we can.
It just kills me that Trudeau is trying to, shush away any criticism by calling all of this racism. Put up one of the many photos of Trudeau in blackface. Let's just have that there. So yeah, we'll definitely have a link to your website below for anyone who wants to check it out. It's really exciting to see that happen. It's scary though to think that, I think in the United States we kind of take for granted the kind of freedom of speech we have and don't really understand that countries like Canada, which we tend to think of as just America without as many guns, doesn't have that same kind of free speech protection.
It doesn't. That was really one of the points of my book, too. I think as Canadians, we were just taught that we are such a law-abiding, well-governed society that it would be hard to believe that you have reporters that are being threatened, just as Canadian politicians are being threatened by a foreign government that's becoming increasingly brazen and powerful on Canadian soil. And the nature of threats can relate to, libel, chill, lawfare, and it can get worse. Trust me.
Right? Can you talk about some of the who is going after you for saying the things you're saying? Like, it's not just regular people or some kind of like street thugs. you're actually being essentially attacked for your speech or for what you publish by powerful people.
Yeah, for legal reasons on this point, we won't use any names, but it's stemming from my book and before. There was one individual connected to a casino. There was two individuals clearly, according to the reporting and according to the intelligence, connected to the United Front Work Department, and all that implies. We just had to look at my book's title: a network of narcos, tycoons, and CCP agents. Look, that's the United Front. So when you're reporting about those people, there can be legal risks and other kinds of risks. And now we're talking about stemming from the reports on the PRC interference, the undenied PRC interference in our last two elections. Certain politicians or entities are making legal threats or legal claims, and for the reasons stated, that we won't talk too much more about them now. But is this a form of an attack on the public interest reporting? We have a system where these cases can be tested, and so that's all I can say is all the reporting will stand the test of time and be defended. And I really do hope at the end of the day there's a conversation around how Canadians' law courts are used with investigative reporting.
So, what do you think is the Communist Party's end game in Canada?
Again, I'll refer to my first story. I put a quote in there where essentially the thrust of the story was the Trudeau government. This document that was presented to Mr. Trudeau in 2019 said has been ignoring interference from India, Russia, and China as the top three offenders. So India, that's a new one to throw in there. Three just like gargantuan nations interfering deeply in Canada's democracy. The substance of the documents I cited in the Bureau's first story say Canada has been ignoring interference threats from diplomats from these countries because Canada values trade and foreign policy wins more than Canada's security. And one of the quotes said, China undermines freedom of speech in Canada. Now, that's just one of the very broad threats, but very simply, they don't want reporters criticizing anything to do with Beijing. They don't want elected officials. They don't want anyone in Canada to say anything negative of China. As broad as that sounds, that's the nature of it. We've heard it very recently. One of the leader of the opposition party, his name is Aaron O'Toole, stood up. This was a very big advance in understanding in Parliament, and said he was briefed belatedly by Canadian intelligence that the United Front Work Department funded a sophisticated attack on his party and his leadership. This included what he called a concrete misinformation product funded by the United Front. And he said this is an attack not only on today's parliamentarians, but future parliamentarians in Canada who can't speak freely about China.
So do you think all of this has led to more awareness within the Canadian government and Parliament? I mean, obviously the Trudeau part of the government was fully aware and did nothing. But, Eric O'Toole speaking about this, do you think these people understood what was happening before all this started to come out?
In the case of Mr. O'Toole, he understood pretty well. He was quoted in my report back in May, I believe 2020 spring, about the United Front PPE vacuum operation. But certainly Canadians and the politicians that weren't aware do now know that Canada's democracy, you can't put it in another way, is being undermined and is attacked by a few very big nations, but far and above anyone else. The Chinese Communist Party presents that deep risk to our democratic institutions.
And do you think the Canadian public is this something they're talking about? Are they aware of what the threat is?
This has been the story for since November of last year. This is the number one story in Canada. And that, that's progress of a kind, because sometimes it felt, like you were just shouting into the wind with these shocking truths.
I know the feeling.
Yeah, you know the feeling very well. It has been the number one story right now. It may be going into a lull, but I'm telling you, there's many, many more shocking stories to tell on this file.
Such as?
Well, look, when we're talking about influence, I remember there was my colleague spoke to someone directly involved in these police station investigations in Canada. And the quote was to the effect that, look, there are so many politicians in Canada that are either wittingly or unwittingly implicated in the United Front influence networks. And the official continued to say, the honest ones had better wake up. So I'm taking from that comment that at a high level, the RCMP believes there's a number of not honest ones. This is not just about willful blindness. This is about corruption. There are stories out there, I believe, in Canada. And while we're talking about the RCMP, I'm sure you noticed that Australia, 60 Minutes, their version did a pretty good report recently where the Five Eyes law enforcement heads came together and said, oh, now we're saying what Sam Cooper's book said. The Chinese Communist Party is working together with organized crime. We saw the RCMP commissioners say that our federal force is seeing connections from organized crime right up to the Chinese state. So look, I felt, okay, I've said something first, and now we have Canada's top law enforcement official saying.
Yeah, you had actually said on our podcast before that there's a specific department of the Chinese Communist Party at the top level that oversees the triads.
Yeah, it can be complex, but I was saying that my research found that China's Ministry of Public Security had some level of control or guidance, protection for certain triad leaders, triad organizations that in turn for their protection provide political objectives to the Chinese Communist Party. Could this connect to underground casino activity? Could it connect to political donations? Could it connect to the corruption of politicians in other democracies? I'm saying yes. You asked me where we're going. If we can get over the hurdles I've talked about, that's where we're going.
I like how the Chinese Communist Party is essentially like the super mafia that's running a protection racket on the other local mafias.
It sounds like a bold and outrageous statement, but it's the truth. Look, the journalist Jean Garneau, others have essentially said you have officials at the top that are running, providing protection and getting objectives fulfilled back. It's a client relationship, right? It's true. They are the super. I'm starting to feel the fear of saying the truth here, but they are the super mafia that is in charge of the super mafias.
It's really not surprising considering the history of the CCP.
You're right. We've talked a little bit about that before, but you can referring to some authority. I've quoted before our former ambassador to China, David Mulrooney, saying, you cannot ignore the deep connectivity in China's history between organized crime, the United Front, and the leaders in Beijing. It's just part of their history, yes.
Well, I mean, the Communist Party rose to power in China through essentially the philosophy of kill people and take their stuff. And so they got like all of the worst people in society to join them in this killing and stealing spree to gobble up resources in China that helped them win the Civil War and take over.
Sounds much like someone that would be running a protection racket pretty successfully. If we're talking about the 5 families in New York way back when, you rule by fear, and that's what a mob is.
So a concern I have is, it seems like the corruption is pretty widespread. And the CCP's goal is essentially to destabilize all of the Western powers. Do you think if it does come out just how widespread this is, in a way, the CCP still wins because people will lose faith in the government.
That's a concern. And again, what you just said was exactly the point that was made in 60 Minutes Australia. They use, especially we're seeing it in South Pacific Islands, they use organized crime to corrupt and destabilize governments. And so there is that concern that once the population realizes this isn't just some wild conspiracy theory stuff, they do say, should I start to be concerned about where I'm paying taxes, or should I start to really doubt what I'm hearing coming out of my government? So yes, that it can be winning in various ways just by creating that distrust between democratic leaders and their constituents.
So whether the Communist Party is found out for what they're doing or not, they still win. This is what Xi Jinping calls win-win mutual cooperation.
Yeah, it's a win-win, and it's a lose-lose for anyone that cares really about freedom and truth. But how do we turn around this very depressing finding that we're coming to? Look, I take courage from the fact that a New York jury, again a couple weeks ago, convicted 3 people, including a former New York cop, for illegally acting, for sowing fear on American soil. America and Australia are showing the way. You need tough laws. We are, multicultural, diverse societies are our strength, but you need to have the proper laws to make sure that thuggish regimes aren't trying to get into our communities and sow their fear and run their protection rackets.
Well, one thing I know about the CCP is that they're very good at changing tactics. Do you think as more things are exposed, particularly how they influence elections, for example, do you think they will just somehow change tactics to a different way to achieve the same results?
They're very fluid, and I think what that is that their intelligence agencies, as authors such as Alex Joske have written in his book Spies and Lies, their intelligence has been, at an academic level, they're very good at getting good messaging out there, and they've been very successful. So will they change? Yeah, I can see in real time, some things will come up. They're becoming masters of disinformation and getting into wedge issues and playing different sides. So we can expect, certainly on the information warfare front, let's just call it what it is, that they will be very fluid, very opportunistic.
Well, speaking of wedge issues, is there any sense that, perhaps the U.S. government is getting a little bit nervous in how it works with the Canadian government, considering how widespread Chinese influence is? Is this driving a wedge between the U.S. and Canada?
Yeah, this is something we've talked about before, and I think I was saying that is starting to be my concern, or there's indications. Now I can tell you definitively. I've heard from Americans that were following my reports, on the PRC interference files very closely. They said it's not surprising to them. They already knew. They knew that Canadian intelligence had a deep level of concern that people in this current government, especially at the top, are not responding properly to Chinese interference, and there's a lot of concerns about why. And yes, I've been told that that people outright say it when they're in their private meetings. Is it the 3 eyes now? Is it even the 2 eyes? Some people look at the UK and say, well, they're facing some kind of vulnerabilities, not as bad as Canada or New Zealand, but they're not fully, if we have a 2 eyes situation, you can just see how much that Xi's tactics that have ramped up since 2012 are working.
And we really can't afford to have it then go to a 1 eye, because then that just draws a comparison to the Eye of Sauron, and then we're not looking good.
Well, yeah, it's not good for soft power of the United States, which has carried heavy loads and done well in a lot of cases. If everyone thinks, okay, now we have the completely divided world where you're either following the United States and doing their bidding, or you're following someone else, or you're acting like you're an independent actor when you're not. And you're right, we can't afford it right now. the Wagner groups of the world, just exploding in front of our eyes, with what could be coming down the pipe in Taiwan. We can't afford this kind of division within Western society.
Under current laws right now in Canada, since obviously the Trudeau government isn't passing any new laws to tackle this, what are the consequences for some of these, for Canadian politicians, the consequences for Trudeau if it comes out, definitively that they've been influenced by the Chinese Communist Party?
The only consequences at this point would be for the voters to speak at the polls and say that either they don't trust certain candidates or they don't trust certain governments. Literally, and I can't stress this point enough, there are no legal consequences. Some people, whistleblowers were even saying, look, foreign interference is legal in Canada. It's legal to run police stations because without that foreign agent registration law, which seems pretty facile but actually is, a very useful transparency item, as it is now in Canada, it's very difficult for federal police to make the link between these proxies or intermediaries in the community, who I'm saying often can be thugs, and the actual Chinese state. But look, there are no consequences in Canada now. If we had a case being brought forward, I could say there are consequences, but there are none.
So even if Trudeau gets voted out and a new government does create laws, basically Trudeau and people like him are just not going to face consequences.
That's what it looked like. Australia was facing, as my first story for the Bureau said, exactly the same manner of threat. They acted 4 or 5 years ago. They've erected their defenses, and their intelligence agencies are in there. I heard the ACO boss say it's like hand-to-hand combat. Foreign spies are whining that we're too tough. In Canada, nothing's happening. So will there be consequences for people that are judged or suspected to have been willfully blind? It's not in the cards from what I see now. You need to get some laws in there first, and then just look at what's happening now and what could happen in the future. Just the mind boggles at what's happened in the past 20 years and whether bad actors will be held to account, because the problem is just metasizing and expounding. So I can't see there being consequences for people that have done wrong.
I mean, it's amazing. Like you were talking about lawfare, that Canadian laws currently are more effective at going against people like you than people involved in actual corruption.
As ridiculous as it sounds, that I believe that's what it feels like to me, and I believe that's what the evidence is showing. That it's an astounding situation. It's more astounding. I can tell you, as you do, I go into the community and talk to people, and I can't stress enough the level of fear in Chinese Canadian, Hong Kong Canadian, Uyghur communities, where people say, I'm afraid for my relatives back in mainland China or Hong Kong. Can I write something down on a piece of paper so I don't have to say those words out loud? People talk about it's the Voldemort situation. They cannot. They're afraid that someone's going to be picking up what they're saying, and something bad will happen. And I think their fears are substantiated.
You had something, Matt?
Oh no, I'm just terrified.
Oh,
feeling your terror. I'm feeling it as well.
Yeah, we've been doing this show a little over 10 years. It's been 10 years of terror. Oh, I like the alliteration.
10 years of terror. I can see a placard for your next episode.
Well, in many ways, it sounds like the solution really does not rest with any individual government. It really has to be the entire world, probably led by powerful Western countries like the United States, Canada, the Five Eyes nations, to really work together to understand the threat of the Chinese Communist Party, because it is an international mafia at this point.
Yeah, unity among the Western powers and extending, I believe, the Five Eyes, intelligence sharing and getting together on what laws are needed to nations like Germany, Taiwan, Japan, Spain, France. It's just the threat that we're facing and the way that is growing, the danger in the world just demands that there needs to be more cooperation against among the nations that value democracy and freedom.
Well, thank you, Sam, for joining us in these years of terror. Where can people go to follow you? You have the website, the Bureau, put a link below, but where else?
Well, yeah, I mean, if they still can Google me in Canada, because that's becoming in doubt, go to the bureau.news.
Wait, what?
Well, there's a little development where our current government, in their wisdom, has passed an online news act where they want to tap into Google and Meta, Facebook, for posting links. But Google and Meta have said, sorry, we're not going to be, extorted, or your terms are just, they don't understand the business model. Google is going to shut off news searches for Canadian news. This came out yesterday. So
whoa,
yeah, it's interesting times in media in Canada and the world, but people can find me. A main point is Twitter. So go to @ScooperCooper. You can find the links to the Bureau.news on my Twitter handle. And so Substack is where the Bureau is posted right now. We're also working on a standalone website and a media property for the Bureau.news. So Twitter, Scooper Cooper, and the Bureau.news. All roads will lead to the work I'm building partnerships with other journalists. You can find us there.
Honestly, I'm a little terrified of what you're going to come up with next, because again, we had you on first to talk about Vancouver, and now it's all of Canada. So I'm afraid what you're going to find out next.
I'm going to Taiwan in the fall with sort of that government invitation program. So we'll see what we can find.
I'm sure you'll find stuff. All right. Well, thanks again for joining us, Sam. It's always horrifying to have you on.
It's always terrifying to talk with you as well. So thanks, guys.
Absolutely. And thank you for watching. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell.
And I'm Matt Gnezda.
And we'll talk to you next time.